Good afternoon. Welcome to the LEF webinar on constructing cloud-native business capabilities. I'm Bill Murray, and I'll be moderating today. The report, Constructing Cloud-Native Business Capabilities, is now live on our website, along with a summary of the report and a short video summarizing the highlights. I'm joined today by two co-authors of the report. First off, David Rimmer, the lead author of the report. David is a research associate in LEF and an industry advisor for banking and capital markets in DXC's transformation team. And as I said, David was the lead author of this report. David and I are joined by JP Rangaswami, who many of you may know of. JP is a well-known figure in the banking and technology industries. He's a company director, board advisor, speaker, blogger, TED presenter, contributor to books, investor. He served as the CDO and group head of innovation of Deutsche Bank and the chief scientist at BT. And as I said, he's the co-author of this report. So I'd like to start by asking David to give us a short overview of the main points of the report, after which David and JP will answer a few questions from me and then be very happy to answer questions from all of you. David.
Hi, can you go to the first slide, please? So I'd like to start by correcting a popular misconception. So basically, if you think that cloud is all about IT infrastructure, you seriously need to think again. If we look at the evolution of cloud, I mean, the hyperscalers, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, they started in infrastructure as a service, compute and storage, but they've moved out of that niche a long time ago. So they first provided cloud native services. These are services for developers to build applications natively in the cloud and take advantage of the flexibility of the cloud through microservices and containers and so on. But about a couple of years ago, they started to move into providing business components and industry solutions. And I'll come along and talk a lot more about that later. And even more, they've now focusing on specialist services around pretty much every single major technology trend, whether that's blockchain or machine learning or AI or digital identity. If you're looking at exploiting any of these technologies, then pretty much inevitably, you're thinking about cloud as well. But it's not just where these guys have invested, but also how much they're investing. So if you look at just in Q1 of this year, their revenue was more than 18 billion. And their profit margins are around about 40% plus, and they're plowing a huge amount of that back into components. Now, the difference here is that whereas, say, a manufacturing company invests in a plant that it alone can use, here they're investing in capabilities that everybody can use. So a key question becomes, how do you capitalize on this unparalleled investment? And another way of looking at this is in terms of not just the evolution of cloud, but the evolution of IT, the industrialization of IT. And there's an interesting viewpoint from a guy called Bill Janeway, who's a tech VC turned academic, and his view is that the digital revolution is half done at best. And that essentially in the first 50 years, we've seen investment in the infrastructure and the networks such as mobile and broadband, the internet, and now cloud. And that's laid down the infrastructure, as it were. And coincidentally, in roughly about the same period of time, in the Industrial Revolution, we saw investment in the railways and the electricity grids and so on. But the interesting thing is that it wasn't until that point that all the really exciting things happened that really changed people's lives. When we had internal combustion engine that changed where and how people live, that we had domestic appliances that enabled women to spend less time in the home and enter the workforce. So you kind of get to the point of, well, if that's where we are in this digital revolution, what are all the exciting things that are really going to change people's lives that are about to come along now? So what's your strategy for the second half of the digital revolution? So Bill, if you move on. And we believe that whatever your strategy is going to be, then a key concept will be cloud native business capabilities. And essentially a cloud native business capability is a capability that from day one is conceived, designed, and delivered through sourcing components from the cloud. And essentially this is a higher level abstraction than a cloud native application. We're talking about a capability. And the reason why that matters is it changes the way that value is created. And so instead of a manually intensive build process, you could much more towards automated assembly and using modules. And the benefits that that brings are speed and time to market in developing new product services and an ability to experiment. An experiment, say if you're looking at cloud native applications, you might be experimenting in terms of a new feature or something. But here we're talking about experimentation of new markets, new products, etc. And of course, if that experiment works, you have the ability to scale fast. And it's also changing the economics here because instead of having, having to fork out to invest in all these new capabilities, you can leverage the investment of the hyperscalers, and that fundamentally changes the game as well. So if you look at just a concrete example of this, the fundamental review of the trading book is a piece of regulation that's come out of MiFID II that requires banks to have a much better understanding of the assets and risk associated with their trading book and allocate capital accordingly. And you can get pretty much everything that you need to meet that requirement through the cloud. So you need market data to be able to price your assets. Well, you can get that through the cloud, the deal that AWS has done with Bloomberg. You want to be able to develop models iteratively, and you can use all the model lifecycle development tools that all three cloud providers have. And of course, you'll be able to run your models, but because you only need to run these periodically and periodic reporting, it's a great candidate for the cloud, and you just use the burst capacity from all the cloud providers. And what that means in terms of benefit is this is going to cost you a lot less because your models will be more accurate. You need to allocate less capital. And also you have more consistent data across the organization, which if anybody's worked in banking will know is a really problematic issue. If you maybe move on. So what we've done here is just tried to put a bit more flesh on the bones. And in order to illustrate this, we need to take an industry. Here we've taken banking again to show some of the capabilities, the business capabilities that you can build through cloud. And we've used a framework called Wardy Maps. If you're familiar with the LEF, you'll know that they often use Wardy Maps for strategy development. And the way these maps work is that on the vertical axis, we have the value chain, sort of proximity to the customer and to value. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the life cycle of a technology from when it's new in the market in terms of genesis to when it becomes a common garden utility. And just to pick out a few examples here, if you look at something like voice banking, well, you can get that entirely from the cloud. You can get the voice recognition, you can get natural language processing, you can get the language output. All three cloud providers offer those services. Let's say you want a new asset management product that's based around the blockchain so that you can provide transparency into the underlying asset and to automate servicing of those assets. Well, guess what? You can get that from the cloud as well. Perhaps you want to develop some new products based on open banking using APIs and sharing data with third parties. Well, again, you're going to build those microservices natively in the cloud. And just to move on to the next level of maturity and something becomes custom built. Let's say you're looking to automate your email processing and you want to be able to extract data from emails and then use models to automate the processing. Well, again, all three cloud providers provide those capabilities. If you want to look at AI or machine learning across pretty much any part of the banking value chain, then you're going to be using cloud. As they say, if you're not using, if you're not doing AI in the cloud, you're not doing AI. But also, there are a lot of industry services. So just to pick one example here, payment fraud APIs. You can now get those APIs from the cloud and do your AML and fraud checks. So this is just an illustration from banking, but I think you could easily get the underlying message here around the extent to which you can build these business capabilities. And I don't think I've said this about any other report that I've written or co-written, but I do actually strongly suggest reading the appendix, because what that does is it takes each of these different capabilities and provides more detail around the examples, but also provides links to all the different services of the hyperscalers so that you can explore for yourself the real depth of the capabilities that they now provide. Move on. Can you move on, Bill? So, okay, so today's catalog of public cloud solutions, they offer a much richer basket of components, but at the end of the day, this doesn't happen automatically, as it were. The whole range of things that still need to happen. So you need to assemble these components and configure them. And admittedly, that will take you much less time. The IT department will spend much less time on knitting together the plumbing and so on, but that's still a fundamental task that needs to be done. And then, as with any new product or capability, you still need to look at new processes, new organization structures, KPIs, and so on. And I know that's business transformation 101, but it still applies just the same here as anywhere else. Another implication is that since components are the same for everyone, I mean, by definition, these are utilities that people can go to the cloud with a credit card. It becomes all around vision and execution. And this is where the skills and capabilities of the workforce are absolutely key. So ironically, in a very tech-driven scenario, we actually find that the people are even more important, arguably, than they were in the previous models. And then the last point here is that your operating model and governance are going to need to be overhauled and changed as you move from build to assembly. In the same way as you would reorganize a factory if you're moving to a different way of building, say, a jet engine, moving from continuous production line to more of a modular development, you change the layout of your factory. And another change that we believe needs to happen at the same time is increasing the emphasis on change as opposed to run. If you look at most operating models nowadays, they're set up to optimize run, cost, performance, performance and security. Whereas in future, we believe it's going to be much more about change. And if you look at the current pandemic, you can see how the ability to change rapidly has been at a premium. And so in that redesign of the operating model, it's not just about moving from build to assembly, but also rebalancing from run to change. Now, if you look across the whole set of those changes that are required to support this move towards cloud native business capabilities, you can see that it's such a wide-ranging and fundamental nature that this is not a job for the CIO alone. This needs the CEO, COO, CFO, and others at the leadership level to be able to drive this change. But there's another thing as well. I mean, if you think back at what we've talked about in terms of what cloud native business capabilities allow you to do in terms of building and launching new products faster, more quickly, enabling experimentation in new products and capabilities, then if that's not a job for the CEO, the COO, and the CFO, I don't know what is. Okay, that's me, Bill. So, Bill, I think you're on mute. I think.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, David. Super summary. Let me ask you then, JP. You can argue that cloud's been around for 7 to 10 years. So why now? Why is this interesting now, David?
Yeah, so I think The thing that's changed is the range of components that are available and the level of abstraction in the fact that you're now able to move towards this more modular assembly, and we're talking about business components as opposed just to IT components. If you look at the build out of the catalog, these guys are doubling the range of services that they have every 12 to 18 months, and it's that change in terms of what's available out of the cloud, and also the costs of integration are going down. Now, as these services are built more and more for interoperation, and APIs and so on become more commonplace as a way of integration, different capabilities. All the promises, as it were, of a service-orientated architecture now become much more feasible because the transaction costs are down. So I think it's two things. I think it's the lowering of the transaction costs plus the richness of the component catalog, as it were.
Thank you. Folks, do fire some questions at us through the Q&A window in Zoom. And what we'll look to do, obviously, is answer as many as possible. So please do fire those questions through. JP, what's your view on why now? What's changed?
Okay, hi. I think that there are, you couldn't get a more of a perfect storm in order to drive towards cloud native than you ever had before. If you take the dress rehearsal of COVID-19 into context and be very personal and at home, I've always considered that when a business is going to adopt cloud, I remember asking questions, 15 years ago saying, when is this actually going to happen? And I was at a conference, I asked people, okay, so how many of you bank from home? And a lot of them put their hands up. Keep your hands up if you bank from an airport. Hands remain up. Keep your hands up if you've used computers whose provenance you have no knowledge of. Hands remained up. And then asked, what would you use the cloud for business purposes? And most of the hands went down. And what I realized then was that the risk decision when you're making a personal decision was very different from the risk decision when you're making a corporate decision. So until the corporate reason to move to cloud became paramount, we weren't going to see businesses really adopt. As I said, that was 15 years ago to 10 years ago, I saw that happening. So over the last decade, culminating in the context of today, where you're saying, people can't leave home. What happens to work when work becomes something you do rather than a place you go to? People can't touch. Therefore, remote becomes a lot more important. And we're living in relatively straightened time in terms of economic activity with various signals of recessionary trends where both cost and revenue become a lot more important to manage right. So the drive towards a why now, you could not have asked for a better set of circumstances than you have today. But part of the reason is because the costs that would otherwise be hard to shift in siloed architectures have now got a mandate for shifting that you wouldn't have had before. So the trust equation shifts, the business sort of advantage is unavoidable. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen that shift take place.
Very good, thank you. Edward, thank you for sending the question through. I'm going to use that in just a second. Folks, can I ask you, please do get into the chat, the Q&A, and fire questions through to us. Thank you for doing that, Edward. JP, you have seen a lot of innovation waves, new things, You've seen people take advantage of it. You've seen people miss it. Who's going to take advantage of this business capability led strategy within cloud? The digital giants, startups, traditional players? Who do you think?
My instinct is that we always have a tendency to go either or and create false dichotomies of these things. It is much more likely that we see a shift towards a partnering and ecosystem approach, and where originally I was being told, if I just go back to the banking sector, we're going to see the digital giants play alone, the incumbents choose to prefer to partner with startups rather than with the giants because they see the giants as competition, and the startups wanting to remain as independent for as long as possible. So I was pretty much being told these three groups will never work together. And everything I've seen in the period since is partnerships and alliances form all over the place. It goes back to what David was saying. It's that if you've got the right components coming through and you have that kind of architecture emerging, people are much more likely to form strategic alliances because it is faster, cheaper, and better to create this sort of multi-vendor assembly where you are one of the participants yourself. And where relevant, you will use a digital giant. Where relevant, you would partner with a startup. Where relevant, you would try to do it yourself. But the market is large enough. You know, it's like Uber in San Francisco originally. When you realize this is a generative market creating a much larger scale than the original, even if the margins within the original market are weakening, then you recognize you have to play a partnering game.
Very good, thank you. Questions are coming through now. One from Ross Davis, one from Nigel. But let me come back to Edward Mattingly's question. The value seems clear. What are the biggest impediments you see to the enterprise shift to the cloud native approach? And what works in overcoming those impediments? If I could get an answer from you, David, and then come back to JP on that as well.
I think one of the major impediments that, I mean, we talked about a few of them in terms of, say, organization model and structures and KPIs and aligning those, but I do think there's a profound cultural change that needs to happen as well. And moving away from a culture of a mindset of we need to build everything ourselves. And one of the things about engineers is that they like engineering. So how do you get people to engineer in the right places, as it were? You know, engineer where they're going to add value and move to a mindset of reuse. And that, I think, is a really big cultural change. And what I find is a lot of organizations or individuals in organizations kind of nodding, as it were, around the concept, but actually when it comes to behavior, and I look at, say, how banks have approached something like FRTB, and mostly haven't gone about it in the way that we've described, even though they would logically, agree that one could. So I think the cultural side is huge here, and the mindset.
Very good. So JP, what do you see as the impediments, and what works in overcoming those impediments?
I was very taken with something Clay Shirky said maybe a decade ago, that institutions strive to preserve the problems they were created to solve. So when you see a shift to going from, most technology adoptions tend to go through a cycle where initially you have some sort of substituting effect, right, from horses to cars or whatever. Then you see some form of extended use. I can do 400 miles in a day rather than 40 miles in a day because I've made this shift. And then you get to a point of native or embedded use where the nature of what you do, it's like a chip embedded in a credit card completely changing the way a credit card would work. It's a very different beast from what it was. Or an Uber-based service for cars, saying the nature of car sharing and the car as an asset changed. So The first sort of impediment to me is that people have jobs to do now, and those jobs get transformed. And I'll give you a simple example. When I was at BT and people went in for using Twitter as a care model, right? Everyone was really keen on doing it. But the shock came in saying, by the way, you cannot do this Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. You need to change the business of providing care to a 24/7 service, because the customer is expecting that change, and you can no longer make that transformation into social media and then claim pens down at 5 o'clock, right? I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the sort of culture change that needs to be there before you can make the business sort of change, before you can really build something cloud native.
Very good, thank you. Right, super topical question here from Ross Davis. I'm delighted Ross has asked this because I was gagging to as well. We're interested in the views of both you, David and JP, on how the cloud providers will be regulated as they become critical infrastructure. David.
Well, it's an interesting one, because I've written actually, quite a lot around how there's this colossal lag between our regulation and new technology. So I think they will gradually become regulated in exactly the same way. If we go back to Bill Janeway's parallel, we saw, regulation of the railroads when they got into a monopoly position. And I think we will see that. And I think, interestingly, at a certain point, a lot of the cloud providers, not just the hyperscalers, but the social media companies and so on, will actually, when they get there, actually welcome it, because that's when they'll move into a period of stable, steady profits that they can look to forecast over a very long period of time. So I personally would see that as a natural cycle, as it were, of development. I think the complicated bit is going to be designing that regulation when these guys operate globally and regulators operate on a national basis. And that's where you've seen the challenge, say, around digital taxes.
Yeah.
So everybody agrees that there's a problem, but trying to get some kind of concerted action is much more problematic.
Super. JP, they're up in front of Congress, I think, fairly soon, huh? So what do you think about
there today?
What do you think about how these people that are generating and running more and more of what they say is critical national infrastructure, what do you think?
Again, if we go back to the Wardy Map kind of manifestation, not everything that a cloud provider does is going to be called critical infrastructure. So granularity in that, saying there are critical capabilities that would be extinguished, as it were, and they will be those that are options, and different businesses would choose different segments of it. My instinct is that not everything that a cloud provider does is critical infrastructure. Where it is, I expect that you'll end up with regulation on 3 fronts. One front is like not being able to turn the gas off or the electricity off, except with some frictions to overcome because of a bill payment issue, etc. So critical infrastructure will mean that the human right to have that infrastructure, even if there are some contractual constraints, will have a business equivalent. You can't just cancel within seconds flat. The second element will be to do with data ownership, where even if the cloud provider says, I'm just a transporter and a storage and I don't get involved in the data, there will be some duty of care. And that includes aspects of protection and the cyber elements, etc. And the third aspect, I think, which will also be important, is that there'll be some ability to migrate between providers. So the freedom of movement aspect will also be brought much more into regulation. So guaranteed access with something that looks like notice structures, the protection around client and customer data, and the right to migrate will all, I think, form part of what cloud providers will have to get to. And I'm probably stealing from the telco playbook as to what they faced when providing critical infrastructure in history.
Okay, very quickly, I want to stay on this subject for a couple more minutes to take in questions by Mark Powell and Nigel Lemon, and then move from the regulation discussion to the heavy lifting of how you actually move. So Mark Powell says, what about how the regulators might consider different geographies? So think about that. And Nigel Lemon says, given Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai and Tim Cook and Jeff Bezos are being grilled today, any thoughts on what they might say? And maybe use a sense of humor around that. So David, geography and what they might say.
I think what they might say is, if I look at the last time that these guys came up before various congressional committees, basically, I don't think anybody got anywhere near the wicket. You know, if I look at, the ducking and padding balls away, I think it was quite extraordinary how little impact that grilling, alleged grilling, actually had. And I think, that in itself, points to how we're going to need some new structures. And I think there was actually a really interesting parliamentary committee in the UK where they actually, the Digital Culture Media Committee said, you know what, we're going to invite some mates this time. And they invited people from, Canada, the US, a whole range of other countries actually to start to quiz, some of the digital giants. And I think that was beginnings of creating some kind of, global agreement across the regulators, because ultimately that's what it's going to take, because these are global platforms. So trying to do it on a solely national basis is not going to work.
Okay, JP, any thoughts on regulation and geography and what they might actually say?
I think on the regulation side, it's not going to be easy, because it doesn't matter what market you're in, global regulation has not been that easy to achieve. Some forms of soft interoperability, like agreements on, for example, data protection, creating safe harbor type structures, have been attempted in the past, but like, we see fragmentation of the internet in general. We speak today of 4 internets. I don't know whether you've seen that sort of meme about, but my instinct over there is that regulators tend to protect for their environment, and the possibility of having 3 or 4 different zones with only soft agreements on overlaps between are part of what global companies have to get used to. You're not going to get uniform global regulation because there isn't a means of achieving uniform agreement across the zones. When it comes to what the Amazon, Facebook, Google, etc. are going to be saying in front of Congress, I'm not going to second them, but there is a sense to say they would say that, won't they? Because you can almost predict that they would look at price and the nature of competition in their eyes being a defense for not having to have antitrust, that there are natural governing models to prevent the monopolistic behaviors, because the question that is being asked of there is to do with antitrust, as far as I could make out, that they're being called to respond, or this is what will then yield. But I also look around and say, well, I remember in the 80s, the long-running IBM saga and the almost as long-running AT&T saga led to a point where what we see as a lot of the modern tech world, the provision of System 5 interface definition to the market, and IBM not being able to acquire and own Microsoft, which I just see as 2 soft signals that were forced by antitrust, created much of the world as we see today. So I'm not expecting major learning, although I enjoyed reading Jeff Bezos' speech or his submission. I'm not expecting to learn a great deal from it, but I am expecting that the defense will be, you don't need to regulate us because there are self-governing market mechanisms.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we're going to move from regulation to transformation. We've got a question from Nigel Lemon and a question from Tim. We're going to cover legacy and we're going to cover workforces. So the question from Nigel Lemon is, what advice did the panel have for justifying and managing the move to fully cloud native when you have a large legacy estate with significant technical debt that is well amortized, and on paper, and here's the catch, relatively cheap to run? David.
Well, I think there's a fundamental difference here between doing stuff cloud natively to build a new capability and moving stuff that you already have into the cloud. And these are two really, really fundamentally different things. So I think where it becomes clear is that if you're going to build a new capability, looking first at the cloud, if you're going to build a new application, doing that on a cloud native basis. But when it comes to moving what you already have, then that's where the business case becomes a lot more problematic. And essentially, there's no easy way around this. It's a matter of looking, through each of the applications and looking at, the cost and the benefit of moving, looking at the interdependencies, whether you can move a single application or you need to move a set of applications, and developing a transformation plan in an awful lot of detail. And in many cases, there won't be a business case to move because maybe cloud isn't cheaper, or maybe the costs of the move outweigh the benefits. So that's we talk about the move of existing capabilities. That's a very different and more problematic and more detailed, methodical kind of approach that you need, as opposed to, I need something new, well, I'm going to do it on a cloud native basis.
Thank you. JP, moving in the context of cheap legacy, moving to the cloud in the context of cheap legacy, what do you think?
I think, when Walmart discovered that networking their warehouses sharply changed the competitive landscape, they left Kmart way behind, and it became one of these golden case studies. When Amazon switched to saying one book to one home rather than a hub and spoke and sort of classic retail model, took Barnes and Noble maybe 4 or 5 years to catch up, if they ever did. If you look at the operating model and the market cap, I've always been frustrated with sunk cost fallacy, saying just because something looks like it's cheaper to run, have you actually understood the cost of change within it and the speed at which that change can be done? Use the opportunity to completely transform the resilience of your system as and when you can afford it, because that resilience says there is an adaptability in terms of your capability, your capacity, the underlying operating costs, the ability to attract and retain talent to it. So too often the same people who tell me I couldn't justify the cost, then point 5 years later towards a legacy estate that now has past sell-by date infrastructure in it, that has beyond end of life components to it, and where it's getting more and more expensive to acquire and retain the right skills. I think, I would again take a leaf out of what David was explaining and I put into the paper in different ways, that you don't have to migrate everything. There are some things where it's better to leave it in its place, but to expose it as a capability in a form where you build new, you just don't bother completely packing and moving lock, stock, and barrel the old. So there are some hybrid models where you don't have to go all the way. but where possible, build native, because that's when you can really build to take advantage of the new context. Determine which things you are going to transform in the migration process. And there will be some things. If I take Tim's question about saying, the shifting is in transforming the IT workforces, I'm saying, well, the first shift we spoke of is the business context and saying the culture change. And that culture change then permeates into the tech workforce as well. And it is only when that culture has begun to transform that you're going to be able to do the heavy lifting. In most cases, you don't have to move everything, but you need to be able to at least expose legacy in a form that you have almost convinced the new world that it's a component that you can integrate, because the assembly process has allowed these pieces to at least look like assemblable components. So there is some work to be done, but you may not have to do the complete rebuild for those that are decay.
Okay, thank you. Folks, please do fire some questions across. We've still got enough time left for David and JP to directly address your questions. So let me take the second transformation question, which we began to touch on in what JP was saying there. And it's from Tim Coleman. The biggest challenge for large organizations to shift to cloud native is transforming our IT workforces from legacy to this modern paradigm. How are the best practice companies making this leap with their workforces? Any thoughts, David?
I think the thing that I've seen in our own workforce that I think is so easily underestimated is just how keen people are to acquire these new skills. I remember we did a town hall recently, and although the town hall covered all sorts of areas, almost every single question was around cloud. What are we doing about cloud? How can I get you cloud skills? So I think that a huge part of this is actually about enabling people, sort of putting training programs out there and enabling a bit more of a bottom-up approach than people might think. I'm not saying that you don't need to look at skills and skills matrices and training and so on, but the thing I've seen is don't underestimate people's enthusiasm to retrain themselves and to acquire these capabilities themselves. They see that new world and they're desperate actually to move into it in many cases.
Lovely. JP, some quick thoughts from you.
I think that, David's on to something in terms of saying, don't underestimate the power and the willingness and the wantingness amongst the staff. But the question is how you signal to them that enthusiasm is going to be made useful, right? And I think management then have to sort of continue to build a culture where the cost of experimentation is kept low, because when you have emerging technologies, it's not always clear who the winners are going to be. And so you have the sort of leader versus laggard kind of approaches to the timing that people would want to. And if people have started migrating towards the new skills because the market lets them, but they find that their employer isn't using them, all they will do is leave. So finding that balance to say, not only do you encourage that those skills to be sort of baked into your workforce, but there is an opportunity for those skills to be used first in experimentation and then later in anger, needs to create the right kind of culture for that experimentation. And that can't be done, in a bimodal, only a specific group of kids get to play, right? You have to think about the ecosystem as a whole.
Lovely, thank you. Right, this is the last question from René Grismer. If you've got internal data centers with a future hybrid cloud approach for internal applications, as well as having multiple cloud applications hosted by third parties, what would be your approach to break down those silos as we move more and more into siloed applications? David, a couple of thoughts.
Well, I think one of the things you need to do is to look at, the question really is around, do you want multiple cloud providers and in which places? Because one of the things you need to be very conscious of is the cost of building in complexity. And I think there is a danger that if you have, you know, a legacy infrastructure, and then you have some kind of virtual legacy infrastructure, and you have a private cloud, and then you move to, you know, some SaaS services, and you move to multiple public clouds, you do need to, across all of that, think about what's the cost of complexity and, you know, technical debt that I'm going to build with all these different options. So I do think a key decision is around how many choices do you need to have, and I think, you know, the key way to simplifying that is to keep that number of choices to a minimum, because otherwise you're just going to constrain yourself and your ability to, you know, to move fast to adopt cloud.
Lovely. JP, couple of thoughts quickly.
I think the breaking down of silos comes not with saying you're not fast enough, you're not cheap enough, and, you know, working through the innovator's dilemma, as Clayton Christensen sort of explained. People continue to want what they used to have yesterday, faster, cheaper, better, until it's too late. So you need something different to force the breaking down of the silo. And I am tempted to say that too much of the past 10 years, we've been using regulation as the driver for that. And that's not the easiest tool in the toolbox to be able to use to do that, because these are long-term, relatively messy transformations. But that same regulator in many markets is insisting on business continuity, on what it looks like in terms of resilience and failure, living will equivalence. And even if I take it out to the banking context, again, the virus and the lockdown has shown a real need for resilience. And the breaking of the silo may come from saying, what will it cost to make this application set and its people and its processes resilient? What kind of stresses can it take? And once you realize the inherent fragility of the siloed structure, you're more able to sell the refactoring and then determine how you're going to bring that flexibility into play. Lovely.
I said that was the last question, but a corker has come through from Becky Fund. Are there key supports or services to offer CEOs and COOs in understanding what's possible with a cloud native business? David.
Well, I think that's where the LEF I think would see itself as coming in terms of helping CEOs to understand this new world, these new possibilities, and then in charting that map that we saw, developing that map for your organization to understand where are the areas that cloud can really support new capabilities that are genuinely going to be differentiated and add value. So I think, as I say, that's where the LEF I think would like to see itself as being able to provide a lot of advice.
Well, I won't argue with that. Thank you for that. JP, a couple of thoughts from you.
And I'm going to speak in allegory to see if it helps, okay? Because of the virus, I have one of my children doing her, she did her last part of year 3 of an American university while at home near Windsor. And I had to make sure that we had the capacity to have a printer and paper for all the things that she would need. Now, I remember buying my first home printer in the mid-80s. I remember how hard it was to configure, how hard it was to get the drivers, how hard it was to install, the complexity of finding it. And then when we started having networks at home, how hard it was to connect two beasts to the network and what things could go wrong in between when we had the physical routers, all the way down to today when I'm saying, wow, you know, I can get online, have something shipped in less than 24 hours to the house, have it sensitive to running out of paper and toner and send me a message wherever it is, and be able to order that either by subscription or on demand, to be able to satisfy myself. And when something does go wrong, as things will, having YouTube to be able to walk to say, how do you solve this kind of paper jam for this kind of device without getting your hands dirty? And I'm saying that because that's what is involved in being able to build a cloud native business, completely reimagining the experience of the customer at the edge, being able to do things that time shift and place shift on demand, having the self-service wherewithal to be able to inform that customer, and doing it in a way that all the historical frictions have been learned from and the lessons implemented. Okay, that's when you have a cloud native sort of business. And being able to do that, when you then say, what do you have to do to breaking down silos? It's almost saying, what are the frictions that a silo represents? And can we untangle each of those frictions to reimagine what the customer experience is? We may be talking about infrastructure, but unless we start each conversation with looking at what that customer journey and experience is, we're not going to get there.
Thank you. So thank you, folks. We're going to start drawing this to a close now, but I'm just going to mention one thing, and that thing is we've used this term map. And I'm going to break all the conventions of webinars at the moment and hold something up to the camera, which is on page 8 of the report. You'll see a Wardy map with 2 arrows on it. One has the term industrialization and the other differentiation. And very recently, we were working with a team that was reforming the business strategy of a company, and we drew their business capabilities in a Wardy map. And it was as though you could hear a pin drop when they saw the capabilities that fell into that horizontal of industrialization and that diagonal of differentiation. It became really clear what they should not do, which was build that bottom arrow, but let the cloud providers do that with their billions of money and just help them do that. And it was very clear what they should do, which is take some of the base components from cloud and build on top of those and differentiate. And it makes it an awful lot easier then to accept the new services that cloud offers. So that's what we mean by a Wardy map, and that's on page 8 of the report. So what I'd like to do now is just finish up with an offer after I've thanked David Rimmer and JP Rangaswami for, frankly, being given very little notice of some excellent questions and coming back with some very good answers. And a thanks to all of you for your time and questions and staying throughout for us, because we believe we can be of help to you. Do read the paper. It's live on the website, Constructing Cloud Native Business Capability. We've got a sourcing workshop, some advisory that uses Wardy Maps, which can get straight to the heart of this. And we're very happy to engage you one-to-one as well, myself and David, or join the discussion. Keep firing us questions, points of view on LinkedIn or Twitter. But once again, thank you very much for your time and your questions, and we hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.